Before the month was past, the terrible and one-sided air conflict entered another and equally disastrous phase. Heavy bombing by carrier-based and army planes shattered defense installations on Okinawa, and, following several weeks of protracted aerial bombardment, enemy troops landed on the island. From the invasion day of March 25th until 2 months later, our defending fighters fought furiously against the carrier planes and the relentless B-29S. By now it was a familiar story. The enemy exacted a murderous toll from our available aircraft, and our air strength continued to dwindle. On March 21st, one of our reconnaissance planes photographed the first North American P-51 Mustang fighter on Iwo Jima. On April 7th, the Iwo-based 7th Fighter Command launched the first Mustang fighter attack against the mainland. 108 P-51S escorted B-29SE on a daylight mission against Tokyo and rapidly proved their superiority over our fighters by shooting down 21 defending planes. We destroyed 2 Mustangs. The new P-51S flew only 10 escort missions since, after their arrival on Iwo, the B-29S resorted mainly to attacks at night and in foul weather. After the war, we learned that weather proved to be the P-51S greatest foe. On June 1st, returning from an escort mission against Osaka, 24 of the Mustangs disappeared in a seething cauldron of violent weather, and 2 other planes collided and crashed. On April 16th, the Mustangs began their first series of sweeps against our ground installations, and by the war's end, we counted 33 such missions. These attacks denied us the use of many of our airfield facilities in the Tokyo-Nagoya-Osaka area. Okinawa-based P-51S shot up airfields in Kyushu and Shikoku. The dispersal procedures forced by the strafing fighters complicated even further our maintenance problems, which already had reached monumental proportions. With most of our airfields reduced to wreckage, the fighters turned their attention to railroads, powerhouses, factories, and coastal shipping. By May, the eventual loss of Okinawa was clearly foreseen. The relentless drive of the Americans, which had started with the Guadalcanal invasion, was now on the very doorstep of the homeland. There was little doubt in our minds that the next great invasion of the war would be the assault against Japan itself. To prepare for this final calamitous blow, Imperial General Headquarters ordered our remaining fighter planes to ignore future enemy air attacks, except in emergencies which would be determined by Tokyo itself. We were under new orders now, to save as many planes as possible for the final defense against the enemy invasion fleet. We feared that were we to continue our aerial defense operations against the B-29S, the carrier raids and the Mustang sweeps, our defending fighter force would be annihilated. We could not face the enemy fighters and bombers without sustaining critical losses. By June, enemy medium and heavy bombers from Okinawa bases began to raid the Kyushu area. Coordinating their attacks with these blows against our southernmost island, the B-29S increased the bomb tonnage dropped on our cities by leaps and bounds. On August 2nd alone, Tokyo received reports that more than 850 of the giant raiders were over the mainland. July became a nightmare of carrier plane attacks. On July 10th, the enemy Task Force 38 steamed off Japan with 15 aircraft carriers, 9 battleships, 19 cruisers, and 62 destroyers. Warships shelled shore installations, and the planes roamed at will over the mainland. 8 days later, a British force of 4 fleet carriers, 1 battleship, 6 cruisers, and 18 destroyers joined the Americans. With our pilots under orders not to engage in combat, the enemy planes reduced literally every target they flew against to wreckage, and the battleships and cruisers hurled waves of shells into industrial targets. The finish was near. Japan lay completely helpless before the tremendous tidal wave of enemy fighters and bombers. Our fleet was through. Our pilots, choked with rage at their inability even to dent the wall of fire and steel hurled at us by the enemy, waited for the final day of reckoning when enemy troops would storm ashore. Japan could not avoid total defeat, but the enemy would pay dearly for every foot of Japanese soil. So stated the government, which, despite the knowledge that by midsummer of 1945 our nation was nearly prostrate, elected to conclude the war in a bath of blood by resisting the imminent invasion with every available man. By August of 1945, the Pacific Ocean and the waters surrounding the four main Japanese islands had become an American lake. Enemy warships in powerful task forces roamed along our coast, safe from attack, hurling thousands of shells into anything which moved on the shore, or into any buildings or other structures they deemed worthwhile targets. Enemy planes flew literally thousands of sorties over every square foot of the mainland. Western Japan fell under the control of the enemy planes based on Okinawa. Eastern Japan reeled under the hammering strikes of the B-29S and P-51S from Saipan and Iwo Jima. The Americans ruled the sea and the air surrounding and over the entire country. We were denied freedom of movement even in the interior, for the searching planes shot up trains, small boats, cars, trucks, communications facilities, anything and everything. The Army and Navy kept its planes on the ground, hidden beneath camouflage, in underground hangars, and scattered to dispersal areas as far as 5 miles from the airfields. We hoarded this last air fleet of 5,130 combat planes, in addition to several thousand trainers, which we would hurl against the invasion fleet, which even then was assembling for the attack against Kyushu. These consisted of 2,500 Army planes, of which 1,600 were kamikazes, and 2,630 Navy planes, including 1,400 suicide fighters and bombers. When the attack came, we could throw in every airplane in Japan which could fly and carry bombs, including the slow and flimsy trainers. It was clear to everyone that Japan could not avoid overwhelming defeat. We knew that our all-out defense of the islands was little more than a delaying operation, which could result only in hundreds of thousands of lives lost in the bitter fighting to come. Despite this realization, the government elected to fight to the last man. It is difficult, if not impossible, to explain in logical terms the mental state of Japan's leaders, who insisted upon resisting what certainly would be the greatest invasion force in history. This determination did not last very long. On August 6, 1945, there arose a new factor. The impact of the atomic bombing, first of Hiroshima and then, on August 9th, of Nagasaki, was not immediate, because it required time before the government could assay the tremendous machine of destruction which the enemy had hurled at Japan. Once, however, our military and government leaders gained a fuller appreciation of this fantastic weapon, which could make even the horror of the incendiary raids seem as only minor irritations, they could not commit themselves to the insane folly of continuing the war. The city of Hiroshima had escaped the fury of the B-29S, and yet it held certain installations which we knew might invite a rain of bombs upon the city. It contained the 2nd Army Group headquarters, which commanded the ground defense of the southern half of Japan. Tens of thousands of troops had assembled at Hiroshima during the war, and the city had become a major storage point and communications center. Hiroshima lay on the wide and flat delta of the Ota River. The 7 river channel outlets divided the city into 6 islands which jutted out into Hiroshima Bay. Except for a single hill in the center of the city, about 200 feet high, Hiroshima was almost entirely flat and just slightly above sea level. Only 7 square miles of the city's total 26 square mile area was built up, and 75% of the population crowded into this area. Except for its center, which featured a number of reinforced concrete structures, the city overflowed with a dense collection of small wooden houses and wooden workshops. Even the majority of industrial buildings were made of wood. A little after 7 o'clock on the morning of August 6th, our early warning radar network picked up several enemy planes approaching southern Japan. Military authorities gave the air raid alert, and many cities, including Hiroshima, ceased their radio broadcasts. By 8 a.m., the Hiroshima aircraft spotters clearly identified the incoming planes as only 3 aircraft flying at very high altitude, and the all-clear signal was given. Hiroshima's radio station broadcast the news of the 3 planes and informed the people that, should the airplanes appear over the city, it might be advisable to seek shelter. Approximately at 0830 hours, Lieutenant J.G. Nakajima, the air defense duty officer, notified me that an emergency telephone call had come in for me. At the time, I was on duty in the second basement of the underground air raid shelter, which had been built inside the Navy Department's compound at Kasumigaseki, Kojimachi, Tokyo. The 3-story subterranean shelter was the brain center of naval operations and the communications center of Japan's naval air defense. The Navy Department headquarters building was destroyed by fire May 27th. All reports from the radar stations, patrol vessels, and aircraft spotters regarding enemy plane movements from the Marianas or aircraft carriers centered here. The telephone call was from the Air Defense Command headquarters at the Kure Naval Station. I heard Commander Hiroki's voice. About 15 minutes ago, there was a terrible flash over Hiroshima. Immediately afterward, a terrible mushroom-like cloud rose into the sky over the city. Many of the people here heard a heavy roar, something like distant thunder. I don't know what happened there, but from the flash and the cloud it must have been something big. I tried to reach headquarters of the 2nd Army Group by phone, but there is no answer. This is all I know right now. I'll send in the details just as quickly as I get them. Kure Naval Station is about 12 miles south of the center of Hiroshima City. I interrupted. Do you know if it was an air raid or some other explosion on the ground? I don't know what it was. Only a few B-29s were seen, that's all. What's the weather like? I asked. Fine. All right. Call me as soon as you get more information. The entire affair made me feel uneasy. There was no ordinary explanation for a bright flash and a tremendous cloud. I felt as though something ominous had happened. I queried the members of the Naval General Staff, but without success. No one had any idea of what could have happened at Hiroshima. There was one other place, however, which might provide the answer, and I called Captain Yasui of the Naval Bureau of Aeronautics. I related the details as given me by Commander Hiroki. Captain Yasui's reply was staggering. I remember clearly his words that, "It may be an atomic bomb, but I can't tell until I actually look at the city." Atomic bomb! It was possible. The words struck a familiar note in my mind. I remembered that long ago the Navy in secret conferences had discussed the possibility of nuclear weapons. The basic theory was no secret. Several years ago, the Navy had requested Dr. Arakatsu of Kyoto University, where the brilliant Dr. Yukawa worked, to study the possibilities. The Army, too, was investigating the theory of an atomic weapon. Dr. Nishina of the Physical and Chemical Research Institute had studied the matter in detail. But this work was hardly more than scientific investigation. Could the enemy actually have used such a fantastic weapon? Meanwhile, several phone calls had come in from the Army General Staff. The Army was concerned. They had been unable to raise Hiroshima, either by telephone or by radio. Hiroshima was a vital strategic center of Army operations. They were anxious for a report. Just before noon, we heard again from Kure. At 0815 hours this morning, immediately after 2 B-29s passed with high speed over the city, there was a searing flash, like a fantastic flash of lightning. It was followed by a sudden roaring sound. In the next instant, houses collapsed all across the city. It is as though a great steel fist had suddenly descended on Hiroshima. Fires broke out everywhere. Everything is all confused. The raging flames and the streams of refugees have made it impossible to get in touch with any place closer than Kaidaichi, about 5 miles southeast of the city. These reports were unbelievable. Everything was so sudden. Regardless of what happened, it was imperative that I, in command of the Navy's Homeland Air Defense, must get to the scene. Headquarters ordered that I proceed with Captain Yasui to Hiroshima to investigate personally what had occurred. We could not take off the same day, despite our anxiety. Enemy planes in successive raids roamed over Japan. On the afternoon of the following day, August 7th, we took off with difficulty from Tokyo. We wished to make a full investigation from the air, but by the time we arrived over Hiroshima, the sun had set. Even on the second day, however, we found an incredible scene confronting us. A ghastly and terrible light flared from the stricken city. The still-burning Hiroshima cast a deep red, flickering glow, which was reflected from the black smoke which billowed upward from the earth. Shortly afterward, our transport glided in for a landing at the Iwakuni Naval Air Base. Early the next morning, we rushed to Hiroshima. Nothing, neither films, magazines, books, eloquent speeches, nothing can possibly express to any other person except those actual witnesses at Hiroshima what had happened to the city and what occurred after the bomb fell. It was an appalling spectacle beyond the power of words to describe. Cold printed or celluloid media cannot carry the sounds and smells and feelings of the shattered city. Hiroshima's debacle is a familiar tale, but all the thousands of stories do not reproduce the shuddering and screaming cries of the victims who already were beyond all possible help. They do not show you the dust and ash swirling about the burned bodies which grovelled and writhed in indescribable agony, the twitching and spasmodic jerking of fingers which were the only expressions of agony, the seeking of water by things which only a short while before had been human beings. Words do not convey the overwhelming, choking, nauseating stench, not from the dead, but from the seared living dead. The unharmed or only slightly injured survivors placed these burned, dying men and women on planks and mats in long, impersonal rows like decaying fish, so that when they died, their bodies would not have to be stacked by people attending to those still living. How many times has the story been told, but with the limited effects of words, of the young mother whom I watched in the agony of dying, not a word passing through her blistered lips, her stomach sheared open, her intestines sprawled in the ash and dust, her living but unborn infant caked in blood and dirt on the ground beside her. This was the Hiroshima I saw. Even today the full story remains obscure, for it is impossible to tell all of the many things which the subconscious happily refuses to allow one to remember. I have never yet seen a single report of the white soldier, a prisoner of war we can identify only as white, as the corpse was terribly seared, sprawled in the wreckage of the city's main street, only 300 feet from Ground Zero. Here was one man's direct sacrifice to the atom of his countrymen, or at least of his allies. Where Hiroshima had existed now, there was only a dirty brown scar on the face of the land. The people did literally nothing, they could do nothing, to extract themselves from the incredible misery thrust upon them. Staff officers from Tokyo who flew to Hiroshima with me, and others who followed, joined in the first relief measures. 16 hours after the bomb struck, intelligence officers learned for the first time what really had ripped the city apart. The radio carried the American announcement of the atomic bomb. 3 days later, at 7:50 a.m. Japanese time, the air raid sirens sounded over the city of Nagasaki, which lies at the head of a long bay which forms the best natural harbour on Kyushu. The city spread across 2 valleys through which 2 rivers flowed. Separating the residential and industrial areas was a mountain spur, which contributed to Nagasaki's irregular layout, and which confined the built-up portion of the city to less than 4 square miles of the city's limits of 35 square miles. Nagasaki was one of the largest seaports in southern Japan, and was vitally important to our military forces with its many and varied industries, including those producing weapons, ships, military equipment, and other materials. Along one narrow strip of the city, the Mitsubishi steelworks and dockyards lay to the south, and to the north sprawled the Mitsubishi Urakami torpedo works. Unlike the industrial portions of the city, the residential areas were the typical flimsy, tile-roofed wooden buildings jammed into a dense concentration particularly susceptible to fire. The air raid warning was given at 7:50 a.m., but 40 minutes later the all-clear signal brought the people from their shelters. When at 10:53 a.m. our spotters sighted 2 B-29s high over the city, they assumed a reconnaissance mission was on and did not sound any further alarms. However, on seeing the B-29s, several hundred people hurried to shelters. Only 9 days before, some high-explosive bombs had been dropped on the city, and several of them fell in the shipyards and dock areas. Others exploded at the Mitsubishi Steel Works and Ordnance Works, and 6 bombs smashed into the Nagasaki Medical College and Hospital, with 3 direct hits on the buildings. While the bombs caused little damage, they frightened the people, who were led to believe that heavy incendiary raids were in store for the city. At 11:30 a.m., there occurred the blinding flash of an explosion that had destroyed Hiroshima slightly less than 75 hours before. Another city joined the ever-growing list of Japanese centers destroyed and wrecked. Even the worst diehards in the government could see little cause for continuing the folly of resisting an enemy which threatened to hurl a rain of these bombs against Japan. On August 15, 1945, with a country literally beaten to its knees, the Emperor accepted the surrender terms. The war was over. Soon after the surrender, the army announced that in Hiroshima 78,150 people had died, that 51,408 were injured or missing, that 48,000 buildings were totally destroyed, and that 22,178 other structures received light to severe damage. At least 176,987 people were made homeless. Listed casualties in Nagasaki included 23,753 dead and 43,020 injured. These lists were at best only informed estimates, and the steady numbers of persons succumbing to the after-effects of the two attacks caused the total list of casualties constantly to rise. Many Japanese sources openly questioned the announced casualty figures, and today the best-informed Japanese sources believe that at least 2 to 3 times as many people were killed and injured as was originally stated. The immediate post-war casualty survey conducted by the Army, which since then has added many names to the dead and injured lists, was as follows. Japan faced the coming winter of 1945 to 46 in perilous condition. Almost all of our important cities, 98 in all, were burned out. The official Army report on the bombings stated that 72 of these had few, if any, important military establishments, that the B-29S had gone after both industry and the civil populace. In the Tokyo-Yokohama area, 56% of the buildings were gone, 52% in the Nagoya area, and 57% in the Kobe-Osaka area. The cities suffered varying degrees of loss of residential structures, Nishinomiya losing only 9.1%, while Fukuyama lost 96%, Kofu and Hamamatsu 72%, and Hitachi 71%. The initial studies indicated that 1,430,000 buildings were totally destroyed. Later, this figure rose to more than 2 million, directly affecting more than 9 million people. At the war's end, our communications and transportation lines were in a chaotic state. Ships which formerly plied between the main islands, as well as those which had sailed to Korea and China, remained hidden in harbours to escape the guns, bombs, and rockets of searching enemy planes. We had lost staggering numbers of these supply vessels, and had all too few available at the time of surrender. Even had we been well supplied with ships, we could not have used them to great advantage, for the waters in and around bays, ports, and straits were thick with deadly enemy mines sown by B-29S. We suffered from a serious shortage of men for land transportation work and stevedores to load ships. Almost all these great cracks in the national economy were traceable to the loss of control of the air over the mainland. On Kyushu, a fraction of the normal train schedules were kept during the day. Many trains which left on trips were shot to pieces by fighters and failed to arrive at their destinations. The constant aerial interference completely disrupted the ferry service between Aomori and Hakodate. Honshu's mainland communications and land transportation lines functioned, but in a wild state of confusion and disrepair, and these operated only because the bombers had not concentrated on our rail lines. We were dangerously short of food supplies for our people. In July of 1945, the government reluctantly ordered a cut of 10% in the staple food ration, which amounted to a ration of 312 grams per adult person per day of staple food, including substitutes. In the seasons between rice crop harvesting, we feared a possible famine, for the islands were virtually cut off from outside food supply. The supply of non-staple food and seasoning was reduced by 20% in meat, 30% in fish, and 50% in seasoning from the amounts available in 1941. As against what was available to the Japanese people in 1937, they could obtain only 2% of cotton goods, 1% of woolen goods, 4% of soap, and 8% of paper. These poverty-stricken conditions caused wild and runaway inflation and contributed much to lower the morale of the people and to destroy their will to continue the war. Our industries, including those which had escaped the terrible blows of the B-29S, were virtually at a standstill, great ghosts of factories no longer with meaning or purpose. Our industrial production had plummeted with the steady and increasingly severe bombings. For the first fiscal quarter of 1945, April to June, coal production was down 29%, iron and other metals 65%, chemical products 48%, and liquid fuels 66% compared to the highest fiscal quarter of the war. The aircraft factories especially had been terribly damaged, with several of our larger plants as much as 96% destroyed. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, our people had sunk to despair. Even by December of 1945, many thousands who had fled the cities after the bombings had not returned. Their paralysis was remarkable. They could not immediately throw off the full terror of the bombings. Their lot was merely representative, however, of the great devastated areas where the people lived in primitive squalor, hungry and with few creature comforts, in want of medical attention and other necessities. And what of our navy, once one of the most powerful battle fleets afloat? When the war ended, we possessed, able to cruise under their own power, only 2 aircraft carriers, one of which was damaged, 3 damaged cruisers, only a few of 41 destroyers left in docks and harbours, and 59 submarines. We still had a total of 829 vessels of all types, but only the handful of ships mentioned above were capable of sailing. Still armed and equipped on the mainland were 70 powerful army divisions, more than 1 million fighting men who formed the core of the defence forces which were to resist the invasion. The Pacific War, fought chiefly in the air and on the sea, came to a halt before these Japan-based troops fired even a single shot in the defence of the country. 29. Jiro Horikoshi's Final War Diary. As we have related in this book, without the Zero fighter, Japan could not possibly have effected her early war gains in the Pacific and Indian Oceans and on the Asiatic mainland. Everything depended upon the Zero's ability to wrest the all-vital command of the air from the enemy in every theatre of action. This the airplane did with amazing effectiveness during Japan's widespread initial operations. Jiro Horikoshi, the engineer responsible for the Zero fighter and other Japanese frontline fighter planes, is seen thereby to be an exponent, so to speak, of Japan's position in the war. The following pages contain extracts from his personal diary, which refer to the final 9 months of the war. They provide an unusual look at inner Japan during these months of great crisis. December 5, 1944. I left Nagoya by train today for Yokosuka. I was scheduled to attend the Navy Industry Conference on the new Reppu fighter plane, to be held on December 6th at the Naval Air Research and Development Center. I would return to Nagoya after completing the necessary liaison work with the Navy on the new plane, travelling about the Tokyo and Yokosuka areas after the conference. On December 7th, however, a heavy earthquake rocked the Tokai area, the southern coast of central Japan. The quake caused extensive damage and wrecked the long railroad bridge of the Tokaido Line on the Tenryu River. In a single stroke, Japan's most vital rail transportation line was cut. My concern for the factories in the Tokai area rose when I learned that the earthquake had been so severe as to temporarily halt all manufacturing operations at the Mitsubishi Aircraft Works in Ohemachi, Nagoya, where I worked with my design staff. My first impulse was to start out at once for Nagoya to do what I could in returning the factory to production. However, I was warned against making the trip by train, since the wrecked bridge meant that I would have to travel by foot in the cold of the winter night before I could reach another train. For months I had been exhausted from constant overwork, and I realized that the trip might cause me to become seriously ill. Nagoya granted me special permission to remain in Tokyo and to carry on all the work necessary with the Navy on the Reppu until the next scheduled conference at Yokosuka on the 15th. Misfortune did not stop with the earthquake. On the afternoon of the 13th, B-29S for the first time struck a devastating blow against Nagoya, concentrating on the Mitsubishi Engine Works factories in Daikocho, Nagoya. The sprawling buildings suffered extensive damage, which caused a severe setback in production. December the 16th, 1944. The Tokaido line still had not repaired the bridge damaged by the earthquake. I had to return to Nagoya, and I was compelled to take a roundabout mountain route to reach the city. I took a Shinetsu line train, which left Ueno Station in Tokyo on the 17th, and arrived at Nagoya via Nagano City late in the night of the 17th. I had been on the train for more than 20 hours. The regular Tokaido line journey required only 5.5 hours by express train between Tokyo and Nagoya. December 18th, 1944. This afternoon, B-29S returned for their second attack on Nagoya, attacking the Mitsubishi airframe works, to which I belonged. As soon as the air raid warning screamed, we ran to a vacant lot near the main factory buildings and dropped into trenches and dugouts prepared as shelter areas. Protected against bomb shrapnel and blast, we searched the sky for the bombers. We noticed several waves of B-29S, appearing white at a height I estimated to be 30,000 feet. The great planes maintained a steady formation, releasing their bombs in salvos aimed to walk across the factory buildings from the east to the west. This was my first experience under heavy air attack, and I remember vividly the screeching sound of the falling bombs and the unbelievable sound of the bomb explosions. My ears rang and I was deafened for hours afterward. December 19th. The Mitsubishi plant manager has ordered an emergency dispersal program. We fear that the bombers will return in ever greater numbers, and if the machines remain so exposed to the giant B-29S, we soon will lose all production. The men have begun the task of transporting machines to schools and factory buildings in the city and in the suburbs. December 25th. The engineering department, to which I am attached, has completed its evacuation from the main factory buildings. We are now located in several school buildings in eastern Nagoya. From December 25th, 1944 to April 1945. The long hours of exhaustion and overwork have exacted their toll. Suffering from pleurisy, I have been compelled to confine myself to bed, beginning on December 25th. It is strange to remain bedridden and to hear the sounds of the bombing attacks, which now come often during both day and night. There is what is to me the now familiar scream of the falling bombs, the thundering explosions in the city, and the roar of the great fires. From my house I have on many occasions watched the frightful flames devouring the homes and buildings, and the towering clouds of smoke which completely over the city. During this period I maintained contact with my projects at Mitsubishi, the Repu and other fighters. Many of my colleagues and assistants visited me frequently. I had noticed as far back as December that our employees' will to work had suffered badly. The reports from my men now indicated that this mental deterioration had progressed even further. Complicating the natural state of despondency because of the progress of the war were the increasing difficulties in their private lives, the lack of food, and problems of travel to and from work, and so on. It is now the middle of March. Apparently the B-29S have changed their bombing tactics. Where they formerly concentrated on the factories and military establishments, they are now attacking the populace through terrible fire attacks on their homes. With a sense of impending total doom, I received the reports of the terrible incendiary attack against downtown Tokyo, which lasted from the night of March 9th to early morning of the following day. The overwhelming incendiary saturation raid appears to be only the first of a new series of attacks. I have been told the heart of the city is gutted, and they have already counted more than 83,000 dead and missing. Tens of thousands of people were injured and burned. Here I have added a postscript. The loss of life in this great air attack exceeded even the atomic bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. What happened to our cities is unbelievable. It is now Nagoya's turn. From the night of March 11th until the early morning of the 12th, B-29S hurled tens of thousands of incendiary bombs into the city. Great fires arose and swept unchecked through the flimsy wooden homes and other buildings. The people fortunately managed to escape a fate similar to the March 9th raid on Tokyo. The comparatively small city area of Nagoya enabled many of the populace to escape the advancing sheets of fire. The loss of life has been relatively small. It is obvious now that the B-29S will attack each of our cities in this fashion. Postscript: more than half of all my relatives living in Tokyo had lost their homes by May. March 12, 1945. Against their protests, I ordered my family, except for my wife, to leave Nagoya at once. Much of the city is already gutted and desolate, but the B-29S may return. My family, escorted by my brother-in-law and my housekeeper, left for my home village, which is located near the city of Takasaki in Gunma Prefecture, about 60 miles northwest of Tokyo. It was strange to be alone in this empty house while my wife is at Ozone Station in Nagoya seeing off the family. It was a time for thought, and I felt deep concern about the future life of my family and my people, about our jobs, and the future of the company with which I had worked so long. When I thought of the inevitable course the war would follow, the certain defeat of my country and my people, I could not prevent the tears from coming. I must confess in these pages that the misery which is in store for Japan has caused me to cry. I was unable to stop the tears. When we awoke on the morning of December 8, 1941, we found ourselves, without any foreknowledge, to be embroiled in war. The realization was astonishing. Since then, the majority of us who had truly understood the awesome industrial strength of the United States never really believed that Japan would win this war. We were convinced that surely our government had in mind some diplomatic measures which would bring the conflict to a halt before the situation became catastrophic for Japan. But now, bereft of any strong government move to seek a diplomatic out, we are being driven to doom. Japan is being destroyed. I cannot do anything but to blame the military hierarchy and the blind politicians in power for dragging Japan into this hellish cauldron of defeat. April 8th. The cabinet has changed. The new lineup suggests strongly that a big change may appear soon in the government's diplomatic policies and its attitude toward the war. April 15th. My health has improved remarkably, and there are times now when I can leave my bed. It is a wonderful feeling to know that I have cheated death and that soon I will be up and around again. For the first time in 4 months, I was able to get a haircut, to take a long-desired bath, and walk around the familiar rooms of my own home. I had improved so much that I was able to walk by myself to an air raid shelter when the B-29S came, instead of being helped as if I were a cripple. May 15th. I was now well enough to return to travel by train. The No. 1 works of the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Limited, to which I was now assigned, was located at Matsumoto in Nagano Prefecture. I left Nagoya by train for the plant. For the first time, I really saw the effects of the incendiary raids on Nagoya. The city is a wasteland, charred and unspeakably desolate. My former factory is a ghostly, steel-ribbed wreck, shattered by bombs and torn apart by the dispersal crews. It is hard to believe that all this is true. I knew that soon I would be well. Strangely, however, I had little desire to return to work. The impression of the shattered city and the wrecked factories will not leave me. May 22nd. Apparently my illness had weakened me much more than I believed. I was ordered to rest, and I left Matsumoto to join my family. For the next 2 months, until July 21st, when this entry was completed, I remained with my family, including my aged mother, and rested as much as possible to regain my strength. Fortunately, the village is small and has not been bothered by air attacks. Even here, however, the air raid warnings sound across the countryside. The enemy planes are everywhere, bombing and shooting and hurling their rockets against our buildings. When the heavy B-29S thundered overhead to attack Maebashi, Takasaki, and Ota in Gunma Prefecture, we could hear the distant explosions, which sounded like deep rolls of thunder, even though we were quite far away. Every now and then I could see the American carrier-based fighters and bombers racing low over the countryside, searching for targets. Our planes can do little against the tremendous power of the enemy air fleets, which completely control the air over Japan. This has been the first time in 18 years, since my college days, that I have spent more than 1 month continuously with my parents in their home. The hills and the rivers are the same as ever, but the fields are different. Most of the copses and groves where I played in my childhood are no longer playgrounds for youngsters, but have been tilled to produce food. The country is hungry. Our ships are not getting through with supplies. Our national situation is deteriorating swiftly. It feels as if certain elements are rotting the country from within. There has been a tremendous increase in the number of people who suffer directly from the bombings. Inflation has spread like wildfire throughout the country, and the salaried class most of all suffers from it. Cunning people propose new random policies and measures to the bewildered government offices and somehow get new jobs, which provide them with both good income and position, while the honest people, the majority of our country, are driven to war or to a life of hardship and bitterness. Many foxy merchants and industrial people flatter and beguile the military. They seek and they obtain big profits through unjust, dishonest business dealings. The government is at a loss to distinguish true from false. The clamour of the favoured grows ever louder. Many a government official is bent solely upon shirking his responsibility. High-ranking officials frequently change their positions. They move about constantly. The country seems as if it were rife with corruption. Rottenness in government is spreading. The whole nation has been exhausted. Japan is quickly losing the strength, it hardly has the will, to continue the war. I met many of my old school friends and had the opportunity to discuss the old days. Often I walked through the hills and along the river banks. Often I was reminded of a line from an ancient Chinese poem: "Mountains and rivers remain unchanged in this war-ruined land." During my stay in the village, I often was tempted to forget my duties and responsibilities in the war effort. The war situation had deteriorated to such an extent that even the people in the countryside desperately wanted peace. They often discussed the possibility of requesting the Soviet Union, the only powerful neutral country between the Allied powers and Japan, to intercede in the war and end the conflict. Japan has made special efforts to maintain neutrality with the Russians, and we hoped that we could rely on her fairness and friendship in mediating with the Allies. July 22nd. I returned to the Mitsubishi No. 1 plant in Matsumoto City, where I was assigned a new engineering position. Matsumoto was one of the very few cities which had been spared the enemy air attacks. The others were Kyoto, Hiroshima, Nara, Nagasaki, Fukuyama, and Mito. The company had tried desperately to organize the new workshops and to establish effective liaison with the other divisions and workshops scattered about the country as a result of the dispersal program. The effort, however, had done little good, and affairs were in chaos. Management was inefficient, and we accomplished little because of the unending confusion. Our efforts appeared hopeless. Bombing damage had become so great throughout the entire country that everybody realized that the war could not possibly be won. It was senseless to continue fighting, but the very momentum of our combat activities appeared to carry us on. August 1st. A report says that the enemy used an apparently altogether new type of bomb yesterday. We learned that the bomb is incredibly more powerful than an ordinary weapon, and that yesterday morning it was dropped over the city of Hiroshima. There are very few details concerning the new bombing, but we have learned that the horrible effects of the bomb, the human suffering and loss of life, the destruction of buildings, are beyond all description. This is all we know so far. August the 10th. Yesterday, again, Japan was struck with the new bomb. This time, the city of Nagasaki was the target. A still more shocking report came in to us, saying that, like a lightning bolt from a blue sky, Russia has declared war and has commenced the invasion of Manchuria and North Korea. We hear that mighty land armies and hordes of bombers already have struck. This means the final blow to a Japan which already is reeling from the unremitting American assault. The local authorities recommended, but with little official enthusiasm, that the residents of Matsumoto quickly evacuate the city, which has, so far, escaped air attack. The majority of the company's employees now are busily occupied with dispersal of their private belongings, of hiding factory machines and equipment. Their daily shop work has been forgotten. They seem to have accepted defeat as only a matter of time. August 15th. The radio has announced that the Emperor would broadcast a special and a very important message. I knew at once that this would be the rescript of a surrender. The transmission was poor, and I missed many passages of the talk. It was of little importance. Japan had been helpless against the enemy for months. The war is over. We were defeated after what amounts to literally a total exhaustion of our national power. This is the first defeat my country has ever experienced, and it is a strange feeling for the populace. Let us face the reality that the Japanese people do not have a social organization which lends itself to a cohesive national effort. We have never been highly trained to combine our intellectual abilities and to think and work in scientific or efficient terms. We have poor natural resources, and the land is terribly overcrowded. Japan has too many vital problems which we cannot solve through our own resources and abilities or efforts. My country will not be able to maintain a civilized and prosperous existence unless we can rely upon the generous aid and industrial and trade intercourse of the world. We require an open-door principle from the world for the good of our people and all nations. I have little doubt that the lack of such things was probably the greatest of the remote and the basic causes of this insane war. Things that our people see before them are economic difficulties and moral confusion. If Japan must grow, then we must face our responsibilities of the future in a fashion entirely different from that adopted by the government, which led us into the abyss of war and utter defeat. And then we must endeavour to secure the fair and generous attitude of all this world. It is easy to recognize the struggle which lies ahead for Japan. I know what my country needs, but I have absolutely no ideas as to how my people should meet their needs in the future. Japan requires and must find those great and sincere statesmen who can and will lead us to a future of peace and guarantee a secure national existence.